Hey guys! Tonight we drift into the soft, soaked edges of a civilization that knew how to grow cities from water. Beneath your canoe, the black water of Lake Xochimilco stretches like a mirror scattered with stars and the soft bobbing of lilies. You barely make a sound. Your paddle slides through the water, gentle, deliberate, and entirely unnecessary for survival, at least compared to what the people who lived here once did. In the distance, torchlight flickers from reed huts and soft voices hum a harvest song in Nahuatl, the words rising like vapor. You're not on a tourist ride through a postcard lagoon. You're slipping backward in time to a place where vegetables had status, mud was currency, and gardeners were architects. The night air smells like warm earth and crushed mint. Your boat glides past small plots of land that look like floating carpets, each one lush and hand-tended, ringed with willow trees that sway like guardians. These are chinampas floating gardens, but not the kind that wobble like pool toys. These are the brilliant inventions of the Aztecs, and they're about to show you what agriculture looks like when it's half science, half sorcery, and entirely waterlogged. You probably won't survive this not without your composting skills maxed out and a good grip on your paddle. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what your local time is. I want to feel your insomnia solidarity. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. A ripple brushes against the side of your canoe. Something just slipped beneath the surface. Probably a duck or a snake, you won't check. You pass a man crouched low, his feet deep in muck, tending to a perfect row of amaranth. He hums something repetitive and rhythmic, pressing tiny seeds into a strip of soil laid neatly over woven reed mats. He doesn't look up. You don't say anything. This is normal. This is the past. The moonlight catches the shimmer of green chilies, squat tomatoes, and the delicate leaves of squash crawling low. It's all organized chaos, controlled wildness. The kind of gardening that doesn't need fences because it has moats. Every plot is framed by narrow canals just wide enough for one canoe. When you float between them, you feel like you're navigating a watery maze built by someone who really loved soup and symmetry. Mainstream archaeologists will tell you the chinampa system could feed up to 100,000 people with alarming efficiency. More if the harvest gods were in a good mood. But you're just trying not to drop your sandal into the murky black. There's a faint scent of smoke in the air. Someone's roasting maize cakes wrapped in leaves. Your stomach growls like a small, sad jaguar. You follow the smell past low platforms draped with drying herbs and firewood, stacked like puzzle pieces. Occasionally, frogs croak in unison, like they've been hired to provide the nightly ambiance. Historians still argue whether chinampas were a central innovation of the Aztec Empire or a borrowed trick from earlier cultures like the Xochimilca. Either way, the Aztecs made them famous and made them work harder. Unlike normal farms, chinampas didn't rely on rain or luck. They were hydrologically engineered to perfection, constantly irrigated from the surrounding lake. Roots plunged through the soil into the shallow water below, drinking whenever they liked. No droughts, no dead patches, just full-time plant pampering. You glance down and see your reflection next to a squash blossom. It looks tired but well-fed. Across the canal, a woman uses a long pole to push her canoe between gardens' baskets of produce, swaying with every motion. Her boat is filled with marigolds, onions, and something red and slimy that, let's not ask, did the gardens actually float? Well, yes. And also, no. Chinampas weren't exactly free-floating rafts. They were more like anchored islands built up with layers of mud, lake sediment, and rotting vegetation until they rose above the water like miniature continents. Willow trees were planted around the edges, their roots anchoring the soil like nature's rebar. You reach out and touch one. The bark is cool, The trunk bends slightly in the breeze but doesn't break. A fringe fact if you like. Though some chinampas were used to grow not food but flowers, ornamental blooms like dahlias and marigolds meant for rituals and offerings. Yes, even Aztec agriculture had a side hustle in aesthetics. You paddle deeper into a tighter cluster of plots. Here the moon is blocked by canopy and everything feels closer, more alive. The smell of mint gives way to damp clay. A dog barks once, then silence. You imagine being a farmer here, waking before sunrise, paddling through reeds, kneeling in mud, measuring time by plant growth instead of clocks. It sounds romantic, until you remember the mosquitoes, and the part where you have to hand-mix human waste into fertilizer. But we'll get there later. Promise. A toad leaps into your boat. You both freeze. You pretend not to notice each other. Somewhere nearby an oar dips. A voice speaks softly in Nahuatl, soothing, rhythmic, and probably saying something wise about the moon. You don't understand, but it feels like a lullaby. The gardens stretch endlessly in every direction. Some are full of tall maize. Others are newly planted, soft and muddy like chocolate cake. Every one of them is a triumph of engineering disguised as serenity. You float past them like a ghost, uninvited but tolerated. And the night continues. The mud squelches beneath your sandals as you step onto a narrow strip of earth barely wide enough for 1 foot at a time. It's not really land, not the way you're used to. More like stitched together sludge pretending to be solid. You glance around to see if anyone else is worried about sinking. No one is. Of course they're not. They built this. You crouch beside a man weaving branches into a lattice, the beginning skeleton of a new chinampa. His fingers move fast, looping, tying, tightening. The framework looks too fragile to support even your backpack until you notice he's layering it with bundles of aquatic reeds. Thick, wet, and weirdly fragrant. Each bundle is pressed between poles, then topped with a layer of mud pulled from the lake bottom with a long-handled basket. You'd call it landscaping. He calls it survival. The process is surprisingly delicate. One wrong layer and the whole thing collapses back into the lake. But when done right, it becomes a little floating miracle, held in place with ahuejote trees. You'd call them willows that sink their roots deep and hold on like botanical anchors. Some of the oldest chinampas are still locked in place by these tree guardians centuries after the original farmers returned to the earth. The man glances up at you, smiles, and offers you the basket. You don't want to be rude, so you try scooping some mud. It immediately slops over the edge. You're not cut out for this, clearly. He chuckles without malice and goes back to his perfect rhythm, while your arms suddenly smell like swamp. Historians still debate just how early chinampas began appearing in this region. Some say 300 CE. Others argue for much earlier, with similar systems showing up in ancient Maya lowlands or even the Andes. One thing's certain, the Aztecs didn't invent the chinampa, but they took it to the next level like agricultural overachievers. And they didn't just build chinampas. They built neighborhoods, food supply chains, even temples nearby to bless the harvests. Everything was planned, even the ducks. More on that later. For now, you kneel down and press your hand into a completed chinampa. It's soft but springy, like memory foam made of dirt. A local boy walks by balancing a tray of seedlings. He doesn't flinch as he steps confidently along a narrow path you were sure would crack under pressure. You scoot back to your boat, safer there. The sun hasn't risen yet, but the stars are beginning to fade. Somewhere out of sight, a reed flute plays a tune you swear you've heard before in a documentary you only half-watched. Something soothing, something mathematical. The reed framework is more than just a foundation, it's a water filtration system. Layers of decaying vegetation enrich the soil while absorbing water like a sponge. You don't need irrigation canals. You are the canal. The entire lake becomes your reservoir and the plants sip on it politely. Modern scientists studying the system have found it's far more efficient than most modern irrigation techniques. That's right, your hydroponic wall garden has nothing on this mud mattress of Mesoamerican genius. Here's your quirky tidbit for the night. Some chinampas had small rooms built of reeds where farmers could nap, store tools, or hide from their in-laws. Imagine a cozy, mud-adjacent hut with the calming scent of algae and chili peppers. Minimalist living before it was cool. You drift again, floating past plots of green onions that shimmer like wet glass. You pass narrow beds of marigolds used in death rituals. Some even planted maize in crescent moon shapes, not for superstition, but because it actually optimized sunlight. A group of women gather herbs into woven baskets, chatting softly. One of them catches your eye and grins. She holds up a plant with delicate leaves and a surprisingly strong scent. Episode used to flavor beans and allegedly to keep the ghosts away. 2-for-1 special. A soft plop behind you makes your skin crawl. You turn. Just a fish. You pretend it's just a fish. Farther down the canal, two elders sit cross-legged on a chinampa, playing Patoli, a board game involving beans, jaguar-shaped tokens, and depending on the stakes. Mild public humiliation, you watch for a moment. The loser sighs deeply, then starts harvesting chiles. That's fair. You feel the shape of this world, now mud layered on intention, plants grown on precision, life floating just a few inches above chaos. The Aztecs didn't tame nature. They courted it, coaxed it, built with it, which in a way feels even more powerful than conquering it. Suddenly, you're jostled by a canoe that comes too close. A boy no older than 10 rows past a piglet curled up at his feet and a stack of composting dung behind him. He nods solemnly like this is the most normal Tuesday of his life, which for him it is. You exhale slowly. The scent of morning earth water ash and a hint of something sweet settles into your lungs. You feel heavy, but not in a bad way, like soil after the rain. You let the canoe drift. You come to rest beside a chinampa dense with stalks of maize, bright red chilies, and fat squash vines curling like sleeping cats. But it's the tomatoes that really catch your eye. They're small, almost jewel-like, with thin skin and a rich, dusky scent that makes your mouth water before you've even tasted one. You reach for one out of instinct and immediately feel a dozen invisible Aztec grandmothers judging you from the bushes. Tomatoes were no joke here. They were status, power, culinary royalty, grown with care, traded in bustling markets, and offered as tribute to nobility. In fact, in some cities, entire tribute payments were made in produce. Imagine being so important that someone pays you in baskets of salsa ingredients. You wish your landlord accepted that. A middle-aged man approaches, his arms full of vegetables. He lays them gently in a canoe and gestures for you to follow. You step carefully behind him as he kneels beside a low wall of earth, really more of a dirt shelf, and begins to explain in measured Nahuatl and occasional hand gestures the system behind it all. This is milpa, he says. Sacred planting. You nod, pretending you knew that. He smiles anyway. Milpa isn't just a field. It's a concept, a rhythm, a trio of plants that grow in harmony: maize, beans, and squash. Maize grows tall and proud, the scaffolding of the team. Beans wind around its stalk, fixing nitrogen into the soil and keeping it healthy. Squash spreads low, its leaves shading the ground, keeping moisture in and weeds out. It's a symbiotic masterpiece, like a botanical polyamorous relationship, but everyone's happy and full of nutrients. Historians still argue whether this three sisters method came from observation or divine instruction. Either way, it worked. Still works, actually. The farmer adds something you didn't expect, and the tomato makes them friends. He winks. You laugh, confused but too charmed to ask. You watch him sort his harvest into categories, some for the market, some for his family, some for offering. One especially round tomato is held aloft briefly in the dawn light like a red sun before being tucked reverently into a basket lined with woven grass. Here's a fringe fact for your growing collection. The Aztecs believed certain vegetables carried heat, not just spiciness, but spiritual heat. Tomatoes were one. They were associated with blood, passion, even seduction. If you wanted to cook something boring into something significant, add tomatoes. If you wanted your marriage to last, also tomatoes. If you wanted to summon a rain god, okay, maybe not tomatoes, but they'd go great with the offering. The farmer moves on to his chilies, carefully checking each one. Some are dried right on the stem, shriveled but potent. Others are plump and fresh, so spicy they seem to sweat on the vine. He warns you with a raised eyebrow not to bite one. You believe him. Your lips sting just from being in the same zip code. As the sun pushes higher, the chinampas begin to glow golden. Frogs bask, birds trill, canoes filled with produce now glide toward the far shoreline where the morning market is already humming. You decide to follow. The journey is slow. You're not the only one headed to the market. Other boats drift past, one piled high with marigolds, another with clay jugs sloshing with what you think is fermented agave sap. A few are filled with fish blinking and flopping, sadly unaware they're on the lunch menu. Then you see something amazing, a boat stacked floor to ceiling with just tomatoes. Red, orange, yellow, even purplish ones. An edible rainbow. The young woman steering it is barely visible behind the tower of produce. She rows like it's no big deal, probably because it isn't. She's feeding a city. In Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, the central market could host tens of thousands of people in a single day. Accounts from Spanish conquistadors describe the scene with a mix of awe and mild jealousy. They wrote about towering pyramids of fruits, rows of steaming tamales, and food so fresh it practically danced. One guy even tried to steal a recipe, probably for tomato sauce. And all of it, every bundle, sack, and basket started here, in the chinampas. A nearby vendor tries to flag you down with a handful of green tomatoes. You wave politely but drift past. You're still digesting the idea that this whole empire was sustained by floating vegetables. And not just sustained, made rich, organized, and terrifyingly efficient. You pass a floating altar, a tiny raised platform where someone has left flowers, maize, and yes, tomatoes. A small feather is tied to a stick beside it. It flutters softly in the wind. You nod as if to say, nice offering. The wind nods back. You wonder how long a tomato takes to ripen here. A week? 2. It doesn't matter. Someone always knows. The system works because everyone knows their role. The farmer, the market seller, the boat rower, the tomato. Even the tomato has a job. Your canoe drifts past another plot where 2 children are harvesting tiny cherry tomatoes. They pop one each into their mouths, giggle, and keep working. No adults in sight. You think about your own childhood and how your biggest responsibility was remembering to feed the goldfish. They're already part of the cycle, already feeding an empire. You float a little farther, the scent of tomato vines thick in the warm air. There's something soothing about it, something eternal. Tomatoes don't just grow here, they belong here. You almost do too. Almost. You leave behind the tomato-laden boats and glide into a narrower canal where shadows gather like folded paper and the scent of damp wood rises. You're not headed to a chinampa this time. You're going to see the thing that keeps it all running. The heart, the veins, the unsung masterpiece of Aztec design, the water system. It begins with a soft rumble, a kind of watery murmur under the silence. You hear it before you see it. Then just ahead you spot it, a wooden aqueduct balanced like a tightrope walker between the reeds. It's not enormous, not flashy, just a humble channel, slightly elevated water trickling through it in a controlled stream. But it might be the most important structure you've seen all night. This canal doesn't just carry water, it carries intention, planning, a kind of quiet mastery. The Aztecs had no metal tools, no wheeled carts, and yet somehow they engineered a lake into submission. They separated fresh water from brackish lake water with dikes and sluice gates. They funneled clean water and drained used water out, and always ensured their plants had enough to drink without drowning. It was a city designed to float and flourish. Historians still debate whether the famed Nezahualcoyotl dike, a 16-kilometer engineering marvel, was a solo feat or the product of multiple rulers collaborating. Either way, it worked. The dike kept salt water from creeping into the chinampas, preserving soil fertility and keeping the tomato dreams alive. You crouch beside the aqueduct and trail your fingers through the water. It's cold, fresh surprisingly fast. A little fish bumps your knuckle and darts away offended. Then comes the sound of footsteps, bare feet slapping against wood. A boy no older than 9 sprints past you carrying a sealed gourd. He hops effortlessly from plank to plank, his destination a small reservoir where irrigation channels are manually opened with carved stone plugs. You watch as he tugs one open and water rushes down a narrow path flooding a chinampa edge in seconds. Just the edge, never too much. You suddenly realize this isn't farming, it's orchestration. Every canal, every plot, every minute movement is part of a broader choreography. And everyone knows the steps. You step lightly along the planks following the aqueduct as it snakes toward the higher ground. There you come across a small hut. Inside, clay tablets not with writing but with etched diagrams, little models of field layouts and water flow routes. A farmer's blueprint. No ink, just memory and grooves. A woman walks in, places a stone in a shallow depression, and water shifts directions like it was waiting for permission. You raise an eyebrow. She doesn't even glance at you. She's already on to the next task. Quirky fact time. The Aztecs believed certain frogs were sacred because their croaks warned of rising waters or pending floods. Farmers would listen in the early hours if the frogs sang too much. It meant something was off in the water balance. That's right. Their early warning system was literally just frog gossip. You glide farther along, eventually hitting a spot where the canal branches into 3 forks. Each leads to a different family's set of chinampas. You can feel the system pulsing, redistributing water like a giant, soggy heartbeat. Modern engineers have studied this network and found it almost impossible to replicate with today's tech without overcomplicating it. It was simple, decentralized, efficient, like Wi-Fi but for vegetables. You pause beside a particularly thick clump of reeds. They rustle. You freeze. Then out hops not a frog, but a raccoon-looking creature with a long tail and absolutely zero shame. It regards you as if to say, "You're in my office," then disappears into the muck. You continue. Not far ahead, you find a canal worker adjusting a weighted gate made of woven branches and stone. He's humming off-key but with purpose. When he lifts the gate, water floods a tiny terrace planted with medicinal herbs. You catch the scent of something minty, maybe sacred, maybe just good for tea. He explains something in a low voice, motioning toward the direction of flow. The chinampas are thirsty. The water listens. You find yourself thinking, how did they figure this out? Trial and error? Divine inspiration, historians have guesses, but no one knows for sure. What is known as this: when the Spanish arrived, they were stunned not just by the crops, but by the infrastructure. Even Hernán Cortés, a man known for burning things down, called it the most orderly city he had ever seen. High praise. Before the burning. You paddle again, following a lazy bend in the waterway that loops you around a tall mound of soil. A compost heap. But not just any compost heap, this one is steaming. Literally steaming. And now that you think about it, you smell something familiar. Something unsettling. It's human waste. But that's next section's fun. For now, you glide away from the compost steam past lily pads and sunlit ripples and toward the next marvel. Because if the water system kept things alive, someone still had to feed the soil. You lean back in your canoe, blinking at the sky as clouds begin to drift across it like lazy geese. It all seems so quiet, so peaceful. Until you realize what it really is: controlled. Maintained. engineered with a kind of precision that would impress even your most finicky plant app-obsessed friend. And still, it floats. The sun's fully up now, but it doesn't feel harsh, just warm like a friendly hand on your shoulder. The water sparkles, birds shout unsolicited opinions from willow branches, and you're standing in the middle of a chinampa, watching a man hold a corn cob like it's a sacred relic. And maybe in this world, it kind of is. This isn't just farming, this is a ritual. You followed him here, this old man with hands like tree bark, wearing a robe dyed the color of storm clouds, and now he's drawing something in the dirt with a twig. A circle, then a cross. Not Christian, older, deeper. The Aztec calendar wasn't just a big stone disc for archaeologists to pose in front of. It was how people lived. When to plant, when to harvest, when to stay inside because the gods were moody. Corn or maize, if you want to sound historically accurate, wasn't just a crop. It was time. It was life. Every kernel linked to a god, every sprouting shoot a miniature version of human rebirth. They didn't just grow it, they tracked it like modern folks stalk crypto trends. The old man plants 3 maize seeds in a triangle, muttering something under his breath that you're not meant to understand. And then, just when you think he's finished, he looks up at the sky, waits a beat, and gently adjusts one of the seeds. The sun shifted. He says softly, "You nod as if this makes perfect sense." Historians still argue whether maize cultivation in chinampas followed strict solar calculations or simply followed ancestral tradition passed down through seasonal patterns. The answer is probably both, because when your entire civilization relies on something, you don't leave its success to chance or vibes. He invites you to help, gesturing to a small pouch of amaranth seeds. You try clumsily dropping too many in the hole. He laughs not unkindly and smooths the soil over with practiced ease. Your planting technique is embarrassing, but your participation is appreciated. That's what counts. Probably. You look around. This plot is precise. Each row aligned with the sun. Each mound spaced like someone with serious geometric anxiety arranged it. The Aztecs didn't do wild guesswork. They observed. They waited. They mapped the stars and the shadows, and then they sowed. You catch sight of a small carved stone tucked into the ground beside the maze. A calendar marker, perhaps, or a guardian idol. It's shaped like a face, stern, wide-eyed, slightly judgmental. You avert your gaze. You've disappointed it enough for one day. Quirky tidbit. For your trivia bank, the Aztecs believed humans were made from corn. Not metaphorically. Literally. After several failed prototypes, the gods supposedly settled on maize as the base material for humanity. You were born of starch and sunlight, according to their cosmic HR department. Back in your canoe, you drift through fields of maize that stretch on like green waves. Occasionally, you see small windbreaks, lines of rocks or reeds to guard young plants from harsh gusts. Some farmers hang bright feathers near the crops to distract jealous spirits. Others leave tiny offerings of cocoa beans or dried chili flakes at the edge of their plot. Farming, but make it spiritual. As you float, you spot another figure, a younger man, this one sketching furiously on a sheet of bark paper. You edge closer. He's not writing numbers. He's tracking the sun's angle with a reed stick and noting how it falls across the chinampa. You raise a brow. He grins. "This helps us know when to wake the corn," he says. You smile, charmed and a little confused. Then you remember your own attempts to grow basil in a windowsill and feel personally attacked by their astronomical precision. The wind shifts slightly. You catch the scent of maize pollen, sweet, golden, earthy. It's calming. Feels like something ancient is settling into your bones. You glance upward. A hawk wheels overhead. It screams once, then vanishes beyond the tree line. Somewhere far off, a drumbeat starts. You follow the sound. It draws you toward a floating platform where a small ceremony is underway. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a few people gathered around a freshly planted corn mound singing softly. A child adds water from a decorated gourd. A woman fans incense over the plot. The air fills with the scent of copal sweet, resinous sleepy. You sit on the edge of your boat and watch. This isn't for tourists. This is how they ask the earth to say yes. Suddenly, you notice the cornfield behind them. The stalks seem to move in rhythm with the singing like they're listening. You shake your head. You're just tired, that's all. Still, you drift again, letting the breeze carry you past more rows of maize in various stages of growth. Some tiny, some towering, some with golden tassels catching the sun like flame. The life cycle plays out here in slow motion, always beginning, always ending, always repeating. You lean back, breathing in the warmth of it all. The cornfields whisper, the wind hums. And somewhere behind you, the old man plants another triangle and whispers to the sky. You smell it before you see it. Something thick, sharp, faintly sour, yet unmistakably human. You'd like to believe it's just compost, or swamp gas, or maybe that raccoon from earlier getting revenge. But no. As you turn the corner of a reed wall and drift into a broad sunlit canal, it becomes clear. You've found the night soil collectors. Canoes glide slowly here, their cargo not tomatoes or herbs, but buckets. Sealed clay containers stacked neatly and sloshing faintly with each ripple of water. Their contents, contributions from the latrines of Tenochtitlan, human waste, also known as caca with a calling. A man in a faded tunic gestures proudly to one of the sealed pots. For the chilies, he says, patting it like a prize pig. You try to smile. These collectors, usually men from specific caste lines, had one of the least glamorous but most essential jobs in Aztec society. They'd paddle from public latrines each dawn, gathering last night's harvest, and ferry it directly to the chinampas. Not to dump, mind you. To distribute, carefully, strategically. Mixed into the soil in measured amounts, it became precious fertilizer. What you flushed, they turned into food. And before you raise an eyebrow too high, it worked. This system, gross as it sounds, kept the chinampas nourished for centuries without exhausting the soil. Modern scientists admit grudgingly that this method was surprisingly sustainable and efficient. Just don't try it in your backyard without permits. You pass a boat where two collectors are carefully ladling night soil into a trench beside a line of young peppers. They're chatting completely unbothered. One jokes about how spicy the chilies will be this season. You laugh too loudly and quickly paddle away before anyone asks if you'd like to help. Historians still debate how widespread this practice truly was. Some believe it was limited to outer regions of the lake. Others argue it was a daily part of city life, carefully managed through a tax-like system. Either way, the evidence, both physical and nasal, is hard to deny. You drift farther into a quieter part of the canals, thankful for a breeze. The scent fades, and the chinampas here grow visibly healthier. Lusher. The leaves glisten, the stalks stand straighter, and somewhere deep inside you realize this is the cycle. Nothing wasted, everything transformed. You pass a floating shed where other organic materials are stored, ground-up fish bones, shredded reeds, ash from cooking fires. It's all composted, all added back into the soil. Nothing is tossed. Nothing dies without purpose. Even the bones feed the roots. Here's a quirky little twist. Some collectors believed certain individuals produced better waste than others. The wealthy, for instance, were assumed to have higher quality excrement because of their diet. Don't ask how they verified that. You really don't want to know. And it wasn't just about human waste. Animal dung, especially from ducks and dogs, was prized too, which explains why that earlier canoe with the piglet also had a second job. In the distance, you see a woman kneeling beside a chinampa, mixing ash and lake mud into a clay bowl with something thick and black. You already know what it is, she hums as she works her hands, never pausing. She's making a nutrient-rich paste to spread beneath her onion bulbs. Her fingers are stained, Her crops are perfect. You pass her slowly, respectfully, trying not to make eye contact. But she notices you and calls out, "You eat what you grow. You grow what you give." You nod and pretend not to think about what exactly you're giving. Back at the main canal, two young boys paddle past you with empty buckets. They wave. "Time to collect more blessings," one says. You gag slightly. Still, there's something elegant about it all. A closed loop. A perfect circle. Your waste becomes nourishment. Your nourishment becomes strength. Your strength builds cities. And the cities, they feed the chinampas again. It's messy, but also beautiful. You pass a plot of chiles now flowering in bold reds and oranges, their scent carried on the wind. You can't help but admire them. Raised on moonlight lake water and, well, deposits of the soul. And they thrive. More than that, they shine. Somewhere in the city, someone's finishing their morning tamale. They'll eat it, digest it, and tomorrow their gift will return to this garden. A tomato grown on gratitude. A pepper raised on what people let go. And so the chinampas continue. You steer your canoe into a narrow canal shaded by overgrown reeds, the sky above sliced into golden ribbons by willow branches. This part of the lake feels different, still, thick with something unspoken. A frog croaks once as if issuing a warning. You squint ahead and notice a strange pattern along the garden edges, holes gouged into the soil, some fresh, some half-collapsed. Someone's been tampering with the chinampas. Not nature, not animals, people. You're drifting through the shadowy world of floating garden sabotage. Yes, apparently, even paradise has enemies. These islands weren't just farming plots. They were land, real estate, status. And like all valuable things, they were vulnerable. Chinampas could be sabotaged in subtle ways, slashing the reed base, tampering with water levels, or if someone really had a grudge, flooding them on purpose. You coast past a collapsed edge where water has crept in and drowned a whole row of amaranth. The soil's too soft. The plants wilted. Someone must have breached the silt wall during the night. Historians still argue how common chinampa sabotage really was. Some say it was rare and mostly tied to political drama disputes between noble families or disgruntled tribute farmers. Others suggest it was a daily concern, especially in border zones where land ownership blurred and revenge could be planted just beneath your roots. You hear a splash behind you, quick, sharp, wrong. You turn too fast and nearly tip the boat. Nothing, just ripples. Then something buzzes in your ear. You swat, but it's too late. The mosquitoes have found you. These weren't normal backyard mosquitoes. These were chinampa-born, amphibian-fed, and apparently blessed by the gods of irritation. One lands on your arm with the arrogance of a tax collector. You slap it mid-bite. Another takes its place instantly. Aztec farmers had a few tricks for dealing with them bundles of burning sage smoke pots, even frog oil rubbed into the skin. You grimace at that last one. Modern DEET feels far away right now. You spot a canoe pulled ashore nearby. A man stands beside it holding a stick with something shiny tied to the end. A bit of obsidian, maybe. He's tapping gently at the edge of a reed base, testing it, watching how it holds. He's not fixing the island. He's measuring it. A land inspector or a rival. You glide past him slowly. He doesn't look up. Quirky fact break. Some chinampas were equipped with noise traps at night, hollow gourds filled with pebbles strung along the water's edge. If someone tried to sneak in to damage the structure, the rattling would wake the farmer or at least his dog. Sometimes the gourd was just filled with wasps. You know, for flavor. Farther ahead, a woman pulls dead plants from her garden. She tosses them into a pile, sighs, and mutters a short curse under her breath. She notices you and shrugs. Jealousy, she says. Always the short ones. You're not sure if she means the chinampas or her neighbors. Floating gardens may seem idyllic, but beneath the lilies and maize is a constant battle. Not with armies, not usually. But with erosion envy and that very human itch to own what's not yours, you paddle gently into a wider section of the canal. A group of children are splashing in the water laughing as they chase a floating gourd. One of them spots you and holds up a wet handful of roots. "Someone tried to poison ours," she says proudly. "We fixed it." You blink. "Too much salt in the water," she explains. "We flushed it out with clean current." Her voice is matter-of-fact, like explaining how to tie shoes. Then she dives under the surface, leaving only ripples behind. You sit back watching them. They know how to protect what's theirs, even at 8 years old. Historians agree on this. Chinampa zones weren't just communal gardens. They had owners. Families who passed them down fought over them, measured them with sticks and curses alike. And when those plots were threatened by nature or neighbor, they didn't call the police. They fixed it. Or retaliated. You glide past one final sign of mischief, a half-sunk canoe barely visible under duckweed. No one around, no one claiming it. You decide not to ask questions. The air thickens again. The mosquitoes ease off. You re-enter a healthier zone where the plants stand tall and the soil smells sweet. These gardens are untouched, guarded maybe, or just lucky. You steer quietly, respectfully. After all, you've now seen what happens when floating gardens make enemies. The morning heat has crept in gentle at first, but now blooming across your skin like slow fire. You trail one hand in the water to cool off, and just as you do, something brushes past smooth, wet, and fast. You jolt back, then laugh. It's a duck. Actually make that dozens of ducks. They erupt from the reeds with a flurry of wings and splashes, quacking in unison like they've got somewhere to be. A few fly overhead, their shadows racing across the chinampas. You watch, stunned by the sheer number, until your guide, a wiry old woman with a voice like dried corn husks, glances up and says without even blinking, "Those are taxes." You raise an eyebrow. She nods. In the Aztec tribute system, every region owed something to the empire, sometimes cocoa beans, sometimes warriors, and sometimes ducks. Yes. Feathered waddling currency. The lakeside regions were especially good at it. Ducks were plentiful in the shallows and among the reeds, and they weren't just tasty. Their feathers were prized, their eggs traded, and their poop, of course, highly appreciated for fertilizing the chinampas. You steer your canoe closer to a man tending a small enclosure made from woven reeds. Inside, about 30 ducks all clustered together, muttering in duck. Some nap, others peck at floating leaves. One stares at you like it's trying to remember where it buried your secrets. The man gently scoops a few eggs from a corner nest and places them into a basket lined with dry grass. He notices you and says 2 baskets per moon. That's the law. Historians still debate the exact volume of tribute demanded from chinampa regions, but we know birds were a standard part of the tax ledger. Some families were even exempt from other duties if they provided enough ducks or duck eggs. There are tribute records carved in stone that literally depict poultry as payment. Try picturing your landlord accepting rent in feathers. Here's a delightfully quirky tidbit: ducks were sometimes pre-plucked before delivery. That is, their soft down was collected without killing them. A little undignified, sure, but practical. Kind of like being mugged for your pillow stuffing. You pass a floating market stall built on a wide platform where ducks are being traded alongside maize beans and flowers. The seller slaps the side of a plump one and proudly declares, "She lays blue eggs." You're tempted to ask why that matters. You decide not to. A few ducks hop down into the canal, paddling confidently beside your canoe like little aquatic merchants. You can't help but imagine them carrying tiny satchels labeled "For the Emperor." You're drawn to another chinampa nearby where a woman is feeding her flock. Instead of breadcrumbs, she tosses crushed lake snails and floating algae. The ducks go wild for it. "Keeps the feathers strong," she says, "and makes them smell less like, well, you know." You nod, pretending you've raised ducks before. You haven't. But you're deeply impressed by the sheer efficiency here. Nothing is wasted, not even the creatures waddling through puddles. You pause at a plot with a long ramp dipping into the water. Ducks wander freely between land and canal, foraging for insects and returning to their nest boxes like clockwork. It's more organized than your apartment. The farmer chuckles. They know when it's tax season, he jokes. Even the gods apparently enjoyed the occasional duck. Some temple offerings included waterfowl, often presented with flowers or feathers arranged in ceremonial spirals. It wasn't just payment, it was art. You pass under a low bridge where children have lined up tiny duck figurines made of clay. You count them 8 each with a different colored beak. Some kind of game, or maybe a warning. You decide not to ask. As you glide on, one duck hops onto the edge of your canoe. It stares at you. You stare back. It poops. You sigh. This is why they're taxes. Further along, a pair of elders argue about whether to deliver ducks or fish this month. One insists fish are cleaner. The other says ducks are more respected. A third voice from a nearby canoe shouts, "Do both." You owe double anyway. You drift past the bickering trio and wonder if IRS agents should wear feathers too. You enter a quieter patch, and the duck chorus fades into rustling reeds and the rhythmic slap of your paddle. A few stragglers waddle through the shallows, indifferent to their legacy. You look out at the water, realizing how bizarre and beautiful this system was. Ducks as taxes, tomatoes as politics, waste as gold. Everything connected, nothing idle. You lean back, let the canoe drift, and close your eyes. Somewhere, a duck quacks approvingly. The sun is higher now, casting light across the chinampas in long, shimmering lines. You paddle lazily through a quieter canal, and it feels like the land is holding its breath. No children laughing, no market voices, just the sound of water kissing roots. Then you see her. She's crouched low on a garden bed, half hidden by marigolds and thick maize leaves, stirring something in a clay pot over a low, smokeless fire. Her face is lined, weathered by sun and stories. Around her, bundles of herbs hang like wind chimes: epazote, wormseed, white sage, purple mint. And beside her, a tiny altar, 4 stones arranged in a circle, a bit of maize placed neatly in the center, and a small feather fluttering in the breeze. She looks up and nods once like she expected you. You hesitate, but curiosity wins. You ground the canoe and step softly onto the chinampa. The soil here is richer, darker. It smells of roots and rain. She doesn't speak at first, just hands you a wooden ladle. You peer into the pot. It's a thick, dark brew with an herby scent that prickles the inside of your nose, smells like oregano. Met a ghost. It's for the land, she finally says. You nod slowly as if you understand. You don't. Not really. But you stay quiet. Historians still argue whether what you're witnessing here is actual medicinal practice or remnants of Aztec spiritual healing blended over generations into something practical, private, and mostly invisible to outsiders. Either way, it's real, and it matters. She dips a bundle of herbs into the brew and begins flicking it across the soil, whispering something too soft to catch. A blessing. A curse. A recipe. You keep your respectful distance and don't interrupt. Nearby, an obsidian mirror lies face up on the soil, half buried. You catch your reflection and blink your eyes, look different somehow. Older, or maybe just tired. Here's a delightfully odd little fact in some rural traditions carried forward from Aztec roots. Farmers believed that planting certain crops without offering a chant or token to the soil would result in spirit loss, a crop with no soul, which in practice translated to vegetables that rotted too fast or wouldn't cook properly. Imagine blaming your bad salsa on supernatural neglect. The woman finishes her ritual and motions you toward a wooden crate filled with dried plants. She picks up a shriveled flower you don't recognize and says, "For dreams." Then she hands you a sprig of wormseed. "For stomach." You accept both like you're in a quiet, chlorophyll-powered pharmacy. Then comes the fringe detail. She lifts the corner of her shawl to reveal a tiny pouch tied around her neck. She unties it and shows you what's inside. Hair, not hers, someone else's, wrapped in soft corn husk. You raise an eyebrow. For protection, she explains, against bad rains and men. You don't ask further questions. You wander a bit, noticing more signs of quiet ritual tucked among the practical. A black stone buried beneath tomato vines, a ring of salt around an avocado sprout, small things, hidden things, things that only matter if you believe in them, and here belief is half the architecture. Historians used to dismiss this kind of thing as superstition. Now some call it embedded spiritual ecology. Fancy term. But it just means this: the land remembers, and the people who work it know how to listen. The woman begins humming low, soft, repetitive. It matches the rhythm of the wind in the maze. You sit for a while, letting the warmth soak into your back and the scent of herbs wrap around you like an old blanket. You notice another detail: painted stones placed at the corners of the plot, each marked with a different symbol. Some are glyphs, others are animals. One is a duck, which now feels deeply suspicious. Another is a jaguar, another just an eye. You point at the eye. She shrugs. That one watches. Of course it does. Eventually she stands and sprinkles the last of her herbal brew into the soil. Then with a nod she walks past you, steps into her canoe and paddles away, her herbs swaying like tiny flags behind her. She doesn't look back. You sit alone for a while. The soil beneath you seems warmer, the marigolds taller. You don't believe in magic exactly, but you're also not about to mess with this garden. You step back into your own canoe, placing the dream flower and the worm seed carefully in the corner. As you push off, you swear the air feels heavier, like you're being watched but gently. Like the land is aware of you now. You paddle quietly, not speaking, not humming, just moving forward. Past rows of maize, past floating shrines, past chinampas, where you're almost certain someone's buried something important in the soil. You wonder, when does a farm stop being just a farm? When does it become an altar? You don't answer. The herbs already did. You drift deeper into the lake's maze where the neat order of chinampas begins to blur. The plots here are older, wilder, less about precision, more about endurance. The water laps higher along the banks, and you begin to notice the color changing, deeper, muddier, tinged with something faintly brackish. Salt. The air carries a dryness now, even this close to water. Your throat tightens slightly. You dip a hand into the canal and bring it to your lips. One taste, just enough to know it's wrong. This water isn't feeding the plants, it's challenging them. Welcome to the contested zones. These chinampas sit at the edge of the lake's brackish boundaries. The places where fresh water from the mountains meets the creeping fingers of mineral-heavy runoff. Here, the soil battles constantly. One year it's fertile, the next it's bitter. The farmers who work these edges aren't just gardeners, they're negotiators with nature. You pass a chinampa where the maize looks healthy enough, but beneath it you notice a ring of salt crystals crusted along the reed lining. The water level has dropped just enough to expose the problem. Someone tried to flush it out, but it didn't work. A woman stands beside the patch with her hands on her hips, staring down at the ruined soil like it insulted her ancestors. She glances at you and mutters, "It used to be better." Historians still debate how widespread salt encroachment was in the Chinampa system. Some argue that the Aztec dike systems kept it in check for centuries. Others believe the empire's expansion pushed into riskier zones out of desperation, trying to wring food from places that weren't meant to cooperate. Either way, this woman's chinampa is clearly losing the fight. You move on, paddling past more signs of water stress. Yellowed squash leaves. Drooping beans. One plot has been abandoned altogether, overtaken by cattails and slick with green film. It's hard to tell where the canal ends and the failure begins. Quirky tidbit of the day: in some border regions, farmers use snails to test salinity. If the snails crawled straight up the sides of their jars, the water was still safe. If they sulked at the bottom, time to pray paddle upstream or start bribing someone for freshwater access. You arrive at a junction where two families' chinampas meet. A thin reed fence barely separates them, fluttering in the breeze like it knows how fragile it is. On one side, a green, vibrant bed of amaranth. On the other, browning tomato vines. The canal between them looks the same, but something isn't equal. Two men are arguing, loudly. One claims his neighbor is stealing water during the night, pulling extra flow into his side canal and cutting off the fresh supply. The other denies it, insists the wind changed the current, nothing more. A teenage girl paddles between them with a stick pointing at the mudline on the chinampa wall like a forensic investigator. You watch from a polite distance. No one notices you. It's not your fight. But you realize this isn't rare. These kinds of border disputes were common in chinampa life. Land wasn't just soil, it was lineage. Ownership was often passed through families, but physical boundaries shifted constantly. Erosion theft and quiet sabotage meant every garden needed its own defense strategy. Some families used willows planted in specific shapes to define property lines. Roots don't lie. Others set spirit markers, carved stones, broken pottery, even bits of colored string tied around stalks like botanical barbed wire. One man's squash vine crossing into another's plot, that could be grounds for generational grudge. You pass another disputed plot. A man stands in the water up to his knees, hammering poles into the lakebed. New boundary, he mutters. Old one washed away. You float silently, the canoe bumping gently against a cluster of reeds. The wind shifts. That brackish taste returns. You don't need to sip again. You just know. A young boy rows past holding a clay jar labeled with symbols you don't understand. He waves and says, "We trade for water now." You wave back, unsure whether to feel impressed or deeply concerned. And there's the truth. Not all chinampas were created equal. The further from the heart of Tenochtitlan, the harder the battle. Fresh water was precious. So was clarity of ownership. Sometimes people built alliances. Other times they built fences. You pass a floating altar just barely above the waterline, half submerged, forgotten. A tiny clay duck sits on its corner, head broken off. You don't know if that's symbolic, but it feels like something. As you paddle back toward calmer waters, you glance over your shoulder one last time. The struggling chinampas still stand crooked but alive. The people tending them don't give up. They can't. Because this isn't just farming. It's territory. It's survival. It's the science of staying still while everything around you tries to float away. You paddle along a narrow stretch of canal lined with thick reeds. The world is quieter here, the wind softer, the water oddly still as if holding its breath. The chinampas look unchanged at first glance, but as you float closer, you spot something different. A series of thin wooden stakes poking up from the canal, forming a sort of fence. Within it, the water ripples in a tight pattern. You pause. There's movement beneath the surface. And then you see them fish, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, darting between the poles, slipping through shadows. Not trapped exactly, but not free either. You've just discovered the aquatic side hustle of the Chinampa World fish traps. They weren't always grand or obvious. Some were little more than submerged baskets or rock-lined funnels. Others, like this one, were semi-enclosed pens made from reeds and stakes blending so naturally into the canal they were invisible unless you knew what to look for. A man stands knee-deep near the trap, lifting a basket slowly, gently, until 4 fat tilapia flop inside. He nods once in satisfaction, then lowers the basket again. For tonight, he says, then adds, and maybe trade. Fish weren't just food here. They were currency. Side income. emergency protein, a backup plan in case the maze got moody. Some chinampa farmers were also part-time fish wranglers managing micro-ecosystems right outside their homes. Talk about meal prep. Historians still debate the scale of this practice, whether it was widespread across the lake or more of a local craft. Some records hint at regulated harvests, others suggest it was informal. Either way, it was ingenious, a self-replenishing pantry just beneath your paddle. But it wasn't all legal. Not by a long shot. As you round the next bend, a splash draws your attention to a small boy crouched near the edge of someone else's chinampa. He's up to his elbows in wet black soil, carefully scraping a thick layer of silt into a basket. Not planting, not harvesting, just stealing mud. Yes, mud theft. This, apparently, is a thing. Chinampa soil isn't just any dirt. It's special. Layered over time, fed by the perfect balance of decomposed vegetation waste and lake minerals. Farmers maintained it obsessively, adding to it, mixing it, treating it like a prized sourdough starter. And when your own chinampa was weak, why bother rebuilding from scratch when you could quietly borrow a scoop from your neighbor's better-fed plot? You watch the boy creep back into his canoe with the stolen mud and paddle off like a tiny fugitive. He never saw you. And if he did, well, mud thieves don't usually take witnesses. You glide farther, passing a chinampa, where a man spreads fresh sediment along a newly planted row of squash. His soil is thick, dark, perfect. You wonder if he earned it or lifted it. You're not judging, just observing. Floating crime scene investigator. Badge not required. Quirky tidbit for your notebook. Some farmers hid bone fragments in their soil, chicken, fish, sometimes even small mammal, to mark their plot. Not as fertilizer, but as a trap. If someone stole the mud and then crops from it failed, they'd say, "See, that's what happens when you take cursed dirt." And while you're at it, let's add one more layer of drama. Some chinampas weren't even supposed to exist. During times of population surge, families would sneak new islands into public canal zones under cover of darkness, build the base anchorage with a few trees, and voila. Instant, illegal floating farmland. Of course, this came with risk. If officials found it, the island might be dismantled. Worse, the trees uprooted. That's the chinampa equivalent of demolition and exile. You pass a suspiciously new-looking plot, small, 2 square, and planted only at the center. The edges are bare, like someone's waiting to see if it gets noticed. No one around. Just one canoe moored quietly nearby. A sleeping dog lies on the bow, or pretending to sleep. You steer clear just in case the dog is part of the security system. As you move on, the fish traps return. You notice more of them now, some simple, others elaborate. One even has a series of carved notches along the stakes, maybe to track tides, fish size, or maybe just someone's version of fish graffiti. You lean over and catch sight of a turtle sunbathing on a log. It watches you with the slow patience of something that doesn't care about borders, soil disputes, or stolen mud. It just wants the sun. For a moment, you envy it. The chinampas stretch out on either side, serene in their beauty, chaotic in their secrets. Beneath the maze and marigolds is a constant hum of quiet negotiation. What looks like stillness is motion. What looks like peace is effort. Because here, even mud has a value. Even fish are evidence. Even a child with a basket of stolen soil becomes part of a system older than the city it fed. You paddle slowly deeper into the reeds, where the water darkens again, and everything feels a little too quiet. And you wonder how much of what you see here is grown, and how much is taken. The wind picks up slightly as you paddle into an open stretch of water flanked by dense willows. Their shadows flicker across the surface, broken only by the occasional canoe drifting silently through. Everything feels still, too still. Then you hear it, a soft thump, then another. Like footsteps on soaked wood. You edge forward and peek around a bend in the canal and see nothing, just an empty chinampa, overgrown and half submerged. But you feel it, the tension. the sense that this place once bore witness to more than just planting. You floated into a story, a battle story. During times of war, these chinampas weren't just farmland. They were obstacles, traps, strategic choke points. The Aztecs, masters of terrain rituals and intimidation, knew exactly how to weaponize their watery world, and when enemies approached by canoe, the gardens themselves became a defense system. Imagine it, a rival force tries to paddle through these tight canals expecting a clear path. Instead, they hit narrowed routes, dead ends, and hidden ditches. Canoes tip. Men fall into water thick with reeds and mud. Arrows come from nowhere. And beneath the surface, spiked roots, submerged barriers, even sharpened stakes, disguised by lilies. Historians still argue how widespread this tactic was. Some say chinampa warfare was limited to small skirmishes. Others suggest that entire defensive campaigns were launched using the floating farms themselves as a terrain advantage. What's clear is this: if you knew the layout, you could trap someone for days without ever lifting a blade. You pass a half-drowned marker stone carved with the symbol for teeth. Charming. Near it, a boy plays with a carved wooden figure, an eagle warrior on one side, a canoe on the other. He dips them in and out of the water, reenacting some old victory. When he notices you watching, he shrugs. My great-grandfather says the maize saved us. You nod. Makes sense. If you can control the food, you can control the fight. Here's your quirky detail. Some warriors disguise themselves as fishermen drifting into enemy territory with baskets of squash and fish. But under those baskets, obsidian blades, darts, or messages. The floating gardens became Trojan islands. Weaponized tranquility. You pass a reed hut that looks abandoned, its roof caved in and its door half sunken. But inside, you glimpse bundles of dried chilies and old arrow shafts, remnants, evidence. This wasn't always a peaceful patch of earth. In some cases, chinampas were burned during conflict, not as a battlefield strategy, but as scorched earth punishment. You attack the food, not the people. Starve the city. Cut the veins. And in a place like Tenochtitlan, where nearly everything flowed in by canoe, you didn't need to storm the gates. You just needed to make sure no one ate. A cluster of canoes passes nearby low in the water and loaded with baskets. They look harmless, but one carries a young man holding what might be a farming pole or a spear. He notices your gaze and tips his head. Then he's gone. The garden around you is too quiet. A memory echoes here. You stop beside a willow tree that looks older than time. Its trunk is split open, as if struck once by lightning or blade. Hanging from a branch is a bit of knotted twine. Old signal system. One knot means peace, two war. There are two. You move on. Deeper into the canal maze, you find another trap. A floating lattice of reeds tied loosely together just under the surface. It looks natural until you paddle into it and feel the sudden drag. Your canoe slows. You could cut it maybe or backtrack. But imagine if it were night, if you didn't know the way. If someone was waiting behind the trees with a bow, you drift backward, carefully avoiding the trap. Floating gardens as weapons. Who'd have thought? Even the gods, it seems, played along. Some altars were built specifically to bless the defense of chinampas, not just their fertility. Warriors would bury offerings in the soil, obsidian shards, blood-painted feathers, before a battle, asking the land to trap their enemies or confuse them. Spiritual booby traps. Soil with an agenda. One last sign appears as you near the end of this watery corridor, a line of stones shaped into an X. You pause. Across the canal, the ground is scarred, dug into unnatural patterns. Like someone scraped at the earth to erase something or someone. The wind shifts. A canoe groans against its mooring. You turn away quietly. This was a battlefield once. And like all battlefields, it pretends to be quiet now. But listen closely. Beneath the maze, under the squash, behind the lilies, you can still hear the drums. Not war drums. Not anymore. Just the soft, rhythmic sound of water moving over wounds. You paddle slowly now, your arms heavy, the sun warm against your shoulders. The water ahead widens, glassy and calm, dotted with water lilies that seem placed just so, as if a painter had arranged them for balance. You've seen maze ducks, fish traps, and sacred herbs, but there's one question lingering like pollen in the air. Did they actually float? You let the thought bob in your mind like the canoe beneath you. It's a fair question. After all, they're called floating gardens. You glance at the chinampas, lining both sides of the canal. They look solid, almost like part of the earth itself. You tap your paddle against the edge of one. It doesn't wobble, it doesn't drift. It's anchored, rooted. So, do they float? Historians still debate the semantics. The name chinampa often gets translated as floating garden, but most of these structures didn't actually float in the inflatable raft sense. They weren't drifting like lily pads or bundled like bamboo rafts. They were constructed on shallow lake beds, layers of reeds, lake mud, compost, and brush anchored by ahuejote trees. Floating only during construction, maybe. But eventually they were tethered. Permanent. Moored by intention. The word floating might be more poetic than factual, but you're not disappointed. If anything, the truth is more impressive. The gardens feel weightless even though they're deeply grounded. They blur the line between water and land. That's the real magic. You guide your canoe beside one and knock on the reed base with your paddle. It sounds hollow in spots like there's space beneath the surface. Not a raft, exactly. More like a sponge built from earth and time. You spot a man trimming the roots of an ahuejote tree with a curved blade. He looks up. They float, he says with a sly grin, until they don't. You raise a brow. He shrugs. First, they float. Then they grow roots. Then they forget. You don't press him for clarification. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some ceremonial chinampas, especially ones used to grow sacred flowers or herbs, were kept semi-mobile. Smaller platforms, often built on bundled reeds, sometimes shaped like animals or gods, and paddled into special spots for rituals. A floating garden. Yes, but also a mobile altar. You drift onward, passing a narrow canal that twists through a patch of newly built plots. One is still under construction. You can see the framework clearly. A grid of wooden poles laid in a rectangle filled with bundles of tule reeds, mud scraped from the lake bottom, and a top layer of rich black soil. The garden bobs slightly in the water, just slightly. A teenage boy steps onto it. It shifts under his weight but holds. He smiles proudly and starts planting squash. It floats now, he calls to you. But it'll learn to stay still. You nod. These chinampas weren't built to last forever in motion. They were meant to become permanent, but their creation was a dance with buoyancy. A little float, a little faith. Some researchers suggest that even long after anchoring parts of older chinampas continued to shift, breathing almost, rising and falling with water levels, expanding after rain, settling during dry spells, like lungs, like memory foam for gods. You pass another plot where the trees look twisted, bent from age and water weight. Their roots stretch outward like fingers grasping for stability. It's beautiful and a little sad. The floating gardens, once light enough to drift, have become heavy with their own history. You look down at the water expecting stillness. Instead, you see movement, subtle waves pushing against the chinampa walls, sloshing gently beneath the surface layer of reeds. It's like the garden is still remembering how to float, even as it refuses to. The man from earlier reappears, now stripping bark from a willow branch. You want them to float forever? He asks without looking up. Then they forget who they belong to. You don't ask what he means, not today. You glide past a small cluster of ceremonial plots. Tiny chinampas shaped like spirals, stars, or jaguar paws. Likely symbolic. Likely not grown for food. One has a mirror pool at its center, perfectly still. You look into it and see your face. Floating. Floating but grounded, just like the gardens. You turn the canoe toward the next bend, the sound of frogs growing louder again. Their chorus fills the air like a reminder this place isn't fixed. It isn't static. Even anchored things can drift in spirit. Even rooted things were once free. And maybe that's what makes them beautiful. The canals begin to narrow again. Trees lean closer. The water thickens with silence. It's the kind of silence that settles on places that have been left behind. You glide into a part of the lake where the chinampas look tired. Bent willow trunks groan quietly in the breeze, and soil, walls slump into the canals like weary shoulders. You see broken reed fencing, wilted plants. Some plots are overrun with weeds, wild, uncontrolled, reclaiming what once was engineered to the inch. You've reached the places where the gardens gave up or were given up on. This is what collapse looks like. It didn't happen overnight. It never does. The Spanish didn't show up with bulldozers. They brought metal horses and diseases. And slowly, over years and decades, the systems that had kept these floating worlds alive started to unravel. Historians still argue over the timeline. Some say the chinampas began to deteriorate within 50 years of conquest. Others argue pockets of the system remained functional for generations, held together by stubborn families and fading memory. But all agree the machine broke. And it wasn't just violence, it was policy. Resettlements, land redistribution, forced labor, European crops that didn't play well with local ecosystems. Colonial leaders didn't understand the chinampas and didn't care to. You pass a collapsed platform. Its ahiwehote trees long dead, their roots exposed and pale like the bones of the land itself. Someone once planted maize here, now only reeds remain. Another canoe drifts into view. A man paddles it slowly, eyes scanning the chinampa edges as if he's searching for something. He stops at one stance and begins tossing small stones into the water, not skipping them, offering them, one by one. You watch in silence. He doesn't speak, but eventually says, "My grandfather farmed here." Then the lake changed. You ask what he means. The canals dried. The water turned. The city came too close. You understand now. It wasn't just conquest, it was growth. Urban creep, deforestation, drained wetlands. Modern Tenochtitlan. Mexico City pressed outward like a slow tide in reverse, pushing the lake back until it became parking lots and pavement. Chinampas don't grow in concrete. Quirky tidbit. In the 18th century, some colonial administrators tried to revive chinampa production, but only for ornamental gardens and elite estates. Floating flowers, for the rich. The rest ignored, forgotten, buried under new ideas of progress. You pass a plot overtaken by grass, its original structure barely visible. A dog sleeps in the middle of it. It raises its head as you pass, then lays it back down. Nothing to guard anymore. In another corner of the canal, someone has built a shack out of plastic sheeting and scrap wood. Not ancient, not sacred, just practical. Behind it, a single row of maize grows a fragile echo of what used to be a dynasty of harvests. And then you see something that stops you cold. A stone marker half buried in the soil, engraved with faint glyphs. Next to it, a rusted tin can planted with marigolds. Old world, new world, trying to coexist. You sit there for a long moment letting the boat drift. Somewhere nearby, a child laughs. Not a loud laugh, a small one. Then a splash, then more laughter. You paddle toward it, and you see them, two children knee-deep in water pulling weeds from a narrow chinampa edge. Their clothes are soaked. Their hands are muddy, but they're working. One is maybe 6, the other no more than 10. Behind them, an older woman watches from a shaded platform. She doesn't intervene, just nods when she sees you. "These are the old gardens," she says, "but they still grow." You nod. She gestures toward the children. They plant. They remember. You glance at the soil. It's cracked in spots, drier than it should be. But there's life. Green shoots, new roots, something stubborn. Maybe you expected ruins. But what you found is quieter than that. Not ruins, remnants. A system still breathing, even if shallowly. Even collapse doesn't kill everything. The woman adds, "We say the chinampas sleep now, but not forever." You believe her. The canal narrows once more as you make your way toward the last stretch of water. The air is thick with the scent of mint and mud. Shadows stretch long across the chinampas, and the sun, tired now, hangs low, a dull amber bleeding into the lake. You drift slowly like a leaf that has nowhere else to be. Up ahead, the world glows green. You've arrived in Xochimilco, the last living remnant of the Chinampa system still breathing at the fringes of Mexico City. A garden of ghosts. Yes, but also of persistence, of stubborn plants and even more stubborn people. Here, the floating gardens don't just survive. They whisper. You pass a patch where tourists once stood, but there are no mariachi bands here today. No loud music or drinks served from coolers, just willows, just lilies, just silence wrapped in memory. A man steers his canoe along the bank, checking a row of maize as gently as if he's tucking in children for the night. His face is worn, sun-wrinkled. His hands are calloused, his shirt threadbare, but his eyes sharp, present. You call out to him, ask how long he's farmed here. He grins small and sly, since before the city forgot how to listen. That feels like a poem, or a curse, or maybe just a fact. He waves you closer and shows you his chinampa. It's neat, proud. Squash curling beneath corn. Tomatoes ripening in the shade of beans. The three sisters still together. He tells you the names of the soil layers in Nahuatl. Explains how his grandmother taught him to read the color of lake mud by smell. How the reeds should sing when they're ready for weaving. You nod and nod and nod. Because he's not just talking about farming. He's talking about memory. About holding onto a system that refuses to drown. And then he shows you the mud. You hold it in your hand. It's warm, alive. Your fingers sink into it gently, and you swear for just a second you feel a pulse. The breath of a garden that's not quite ready to go. Historians still argue whether the chinampas of Xochimilco can be saved, whether modern pollution, changing water tables, and creeping urban sprawl have already doomed them to souvenir status. But standing here, covered in sun and sweat and soil, it feels like the argument misses the point. They're still here, and they're still growing. The man points toward a plot farther down the canal. That one's my son's, he says. He grows flowers. You paddle to it. Bright marigolds stretch toward the light orange and gold and impossibly vibrant. The scent is strong, almost sacred. In Aztec times, these flowers were offerings for the dead. Now they bloom above soil shaped by the living. Quirky last note. Some locals say that when the chinampas are truly at peace, you can hear them at night. Not frogs, not wind, but them. The soil, the trees, the water remembering. You close your eyes, and for a moment the canal disappears. So does the city. So does the sun. You're floating again, only this time not in a canoe. In memory, in the rhythm of something older than words but softer than silence. The breath of the chinampas surrounds you. The water sighs. The gardens sleep. And now, so do you. Let yourself sink gently now. You've seen the gardens grow seed by seed, reed by reed. You've walked where roots drink lake water and maize aligns with stars. You've watched hands that remember more than books ever will, and you've heard whispers where others only hear wind. The chinampas may not float anymore, but they rise in other ways. They rise in morning rituals, in stolen mud returned to the earth, in ducks that still glide like gossip over canal water, in quiet chants over herbs, in old men who shape soil like prayers. Tonight, as you rest, imagine the soft rocking of the canoe once more, not moving forward, not backward, just drifting. A willow leans close overhead. You smell its bark, earthy, a little bitter, comforting in its quiet honesty. The frogs begin their song again. Not urgent, just enough to let you know they're still watching, still remembering. The reeds sway gently. Somewhere far off, someone hums. The water is black now, reflective, not empty. You dip your hand in. The mud still welcomes you. The land still holds your weight. And in your chest, something very old, something green, something quiet settles. Grows roots. Breath slows. Muscles soften. And as you drift far beneath the stars and above the lakebed, the floating gardens of your mind stretch wide. They're patient, and they're still blooming.